And hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing Coffee Talk editorial series. Today's topic is Managed Detection and Response 101, why MDR and why now? Each hour-long information-packed episode features observations and insights of an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. So many thanks to the underwriting sponsor of this episode, Red Canary. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm Gladys Rama, Editorial Director, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notifications. This episode is being recorded for later access, so keep an eye out for an email from us with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next couple of days. Second, we're going to have some time during the talk for some questions, so please feel free to type your questions as they come to you into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Third, on the left-hand side of your screen, you're going to see a couple of extra resources provided to you by our sponsor, so please be sure to check those out. And finally, as a small thank you to the first 200 attendees who stick with us to the end, we are going to be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with all of the info. Trademark. Now, let's meet our first presenter. If you have been to any of our other coffee talks or summits beforehand, you'll probably know him, you'll recognize him. He is Ian Thornton-Trump. He is currently the CISO for Cyjax Limited in the UK and the CTO of Octopi Managed Services in Canada. Ian has 25 years of experience in IT security and information technology. From 1989 to 92, Ian served with the Canadian Forces. In 2002, he joined the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserves and then retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. Afterward, he worked as a cybersecurity analyst, consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. Ian has deep experience with the threats facing SMBs and enterprises. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in building security operations, working as a virtual CISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs. Ian, as always, we're happy to have you here. Take it away.
I'm so excited to do this one, and I just want to recognize that we couldn't do this without Red Canary, our sponsor, and the fact that they're helping me get the word out about all the great stuff that they're doing is just, it's absolutely my pleasure today. So as you can see, I put up like the military stuff, the policing stuff, but I also included music and support to the information security community that I'm really passionate about. And a couple of the projects that I'm working on right now is to bring more awareness of the changes of global climate change and how that's going to impact the whole IT industry. And I would say also that I know that there's been unprecedented layoffs in tech, and my heart goes out to all of those that might have gotten released from their jobs, and wish them the very best of luck. So this is about all sorts of really interesting things about threat actors and about businesses that are getting victimized at unprecedented rates. And to describe the current threat landscape, I picked a forest fire slide. Now, this is kind of really interesting to me from a metaphorical perspective because you can see some trees that are on fire, and you can see other trees that are on fire, and then you can see the smoke kind of obscuring our vision and stuff like this. And I think this is really a great way of describing the randomness, if you will, of the current threat landscape and just how difficult it is to defend these complex networks that in some cases maybe 30, 40, maybe even 50 years old if you're working and operating in the OT space, for instance. So the landscape has gotten increasingly complex in a large part due to endpoints that are on-premise, that have vital business and critical activities and capabilities that your business relies on, and then of course the rush to the cloud, and all of the cloud services are there. And I think, to be fair, one of the biggest challenges we have today is that visibility aspect, that holistic view of both the threat actors and their various activities. And we're going to take a look at this from a number of different perspectives today, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about it's your organization versus the threat actors. And really, in a lot of cases, those organizations are really not up to this fight against a modern adversary. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about it from the weakness and vulnerability perspective. We'll talk about it from the human mistakes and insider threat. And I have an amazing document that I'm going to share with you folks on this, because this document, which is an indictment of a cyber criminal, is really going to paint you the picture of why MDR is so vitally important and how it can literally save your business before the worst things happen. I want to talk a little bit about the rapid exploitation that we see in the industry now. We used to have we used to have about a 30-day window to patch and update systems against critical vulnerabilities. And we know that that is not even adequate to deal with some unethical cybersecurity researchers that drop proof of concepts on social media that instantly become weaponized and turn into some of the catastrophes that we've seen in the last little while. So we're definitely going to talk about that. And then, of course, your own organization. Because of the complexity, because of the fact that we haven't really, in even the mid-market, I think, gotten the very rare opportunity to retune everything, to greenfield build the network. We're inheriting legacy, and every year that we, exempt something and say that it's outside of the scope of responsibility for the business, we add more to this pile of Tinder dry fuel for a potential ransomware outbreak. Now, you may be asking yourself, Ian, why did you put this map, which looks like it's from World War II, into your slide deck? Well, I wanted to point out a couple of really interesting things about how we're getting attacked today. And as you can see, it's set in World War II, and it was the opening salvo of Operation Barbarossa. But you'll see that the Germans never attacked Russian positions head on. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important from a couple of reasons in the context of the Ukraine versus Russia. But more importantly, it shows that the frontal assault on your business is not what you need to focus on. Because actually, and I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal that suggested that ransomware and payments to criminal actors is actually going down. And this is because businesses that are expecting the head-on attack are more prepared than they've ever been before and have really focused on recovery and early detection. Insert MDR as part of that early detection strategy. And they can take mitigative action with a whole bunch of different layers of their cybersecurity posture. So what are we looking for now? We're looking for those situations where the attack comes from a direction that we didn't expect. And that's indicative of all sorts of ways that, the cyber threat actor can maneuver into your supply chain, can come at you with a social engineering type of attack that gets you to do something like, click on a link over social media, which is a really interesting attack vector because it's believed that in a couple of cases, a compromise of a phone from an SMS message led to the defeat of multi-factor capabilities to prevent a threat actor from getting inside the organization. So this is really interesting to me to see the metaphors from a tactical perspective. Now, let's get into, oops, you know what? I did the exact thing that I wasn't supposed to do. There we go. Okay. So a big part of your organizations versus the threat actors are the systems that you have that are vulnerable that they are legacy systems. We're talking about end-of-life stuff. We're talking about old versions of Red Hat that are exposed to the internet. We're talking about, in a very recent case, the exposure of EXSI or VMware, older versions of VMware that were exposed to the internet. Right? We're seeing this picked up also in things like the Microsoft Exchange on-premise or non-up-to-date remote desktop protocol or remote desktop servers that have been degraded in order to try and support legacy clients. We have a lack of compensating security controls in a lot of cases in front of them. This is maybe because the organization is a bit on the thrifty side and doesn't quite understand how to properly deploy a CDN and feels that that might cost a lot of money, or a web application firewall, along with different built-in capabilities within the Azure and AWS platform. There is a lot of things that you can do to prevent from getting hacked. And managed detection and response is like one of those things that makes up your new layered defense because of, for two things, that side channel attack where it comes from an unexpected direction, and then also when you're dealing with other types of attacks, you're into a situation where the first indicators of compromise may not tell the whole story about what has happened, and this is why an investigation needs to spool up. Now, one of the most interesting types of attacks, and we will identify this, I think, and go a little bit more in depth in this, is inaccuracies in the configuration management database, or as I like to say, ITM, or information technology management. This is infrastructure that has been neglected, forgotten about, etc., but still provides a way in. And you say this, I see this as being a really important threat vector, because if you don't know about it, you can't connect it, you can't defend it, of course, but also in a lot of cases, this may be, a thing for developers to access or a third party that everyone has forgotten about. It's too easy to spin up things in the cloud and not have them adequately protected as one-offs, right? Flat networks are a huge issue. This contributes a great deal to the propagation of ransomware across the organization, or a lateral movement by a threat actor to get at the crown jewels of your organization. So these are things that contribute to the difficulty that we have in defending assets. And don't even get me started about those assets that are out there that are in the hands of the sales and marketing people that are traveling the globe, doing their things, working from conferences, working from dodgy networks and coffee shops or pubs, and then also, of course, hotel Wi-Fi and all its delights. So there is another aspect to this that you need complete coverage, because what gets infected out there might then allow an attacker inside your defenses if it's not adequately protected. So this is about having that view that includes the inside and the outside and all of the things that move between the inside and outside. There also is a difficulty that we're having right now in these uncertain economic times. So there is a lot of cases for cybersecurity organizations, they've hired the people, but they have not made the continuous investment in building those cybersecurity skill sets or putting folks on courses to be able to defend that ever-evolving cloud infrastructure and just keeping up with the latest technologies that are available on the Amazon platform or the Azure platform. There's also a cost consciousness in the fact that we have a new paradigm where a lot of sensitive documents and sensitive information is found on organizations' SharePoint. And we're going to talk about that relationship and how difficult it can be to defend the endpoints against what data they actually have access to and how that data can be compromised. And then, of course, we have one of the biggest issues in cybersecurity, I think, is the laissez-faire vulnerability practices that are out there, especially when it comes to that legacy technology issues where some stuff just can't be patched, or it breaks, and the entire organization, especially in an OT manufacturing environment, is now at risk. So you're up against it. Most enterprises that I'm familiar with, that where I've worked and stuff like that, have all of these issues when it comes to the organization's defensive posture and cyber hygiene. So especially in the mid-market or in a situation where you've outsourced cybersecurity capabilities, MDR is now a big issue that requires being addressed. So, as we've kind of pointed out on numerous occasions, weakness and vulnerability is a huge issue. And number one at the top of the list is the bequeath, the CISO bequeath that they've given to the cybersecurity industry, which is their exploited vulnerability updates. So this is where I go on a bit of a rant and call out that a CVE9, one of the scariest things on the internet, and if you're following InfoSec Twitter, it's like the end of the world that we know it, as we know it, depending on the weighing in of many pundits. And in this article where I got quoted by Dave Winder about this issue now where U.S. Security Agency is ordering 3 weeks to update all government systems, it comes at a time when we realize that one of the biggest vectors of attack is, of course, the operating system. It's been there for a while, but we're now seeing a renewed issue around the Microsoft Office suite and the various vulnerabilities that can be found in that. Because after all, clicking on something and saying enable macros has become a time-honored tradition going back to the various early days of Office as a way to land potential malware on an endpoint. So even though Microsoft has done its level best to address this issue by disabling that feature or making it harder to enable, the reality is it's been out there so long and in use by especially accounting departments and Excel spreadsheets, and any sort of like business reporting dashboard that's been built that sucks in data from a number of different places. All of that was macro-driven, all of that was visual basic, and that stuff can be abused in order to land malware. So what we've seen is these tooling gaps becoming really important and dealing with the on-premise infrastructure that we have rapidly when CISA tells you that this is under active exploit by a threat actor. So even though we look at the CVE rating of a vulnerability and we go, oh, that's a 9, that's a 9.5, I got to patch that immediately. Let's throw some context around that, right? Let's understand that we might have mitigating controls in place that don't make it a 5-alarm emergency and burn out staff and cost the organization a lot of unanticipated downtime, especially when that vulnerability might be one of those that on discovery actually may not be nearly as impactful or actually isn't the catastrophic end of the internet. So this is why CISA's tool of the exploited vulnerability, or as I call it in the article, the KEV, and you'll see the known vulnerability that are being exploited. It's really important to take that into context when you're talking about vulnerability management. Now, again, I mentioned that I called out the legacy infrastructure can't be patched or can't be isolated. This is a reality of many businesses that are using old ways of communicating or authenticating within your organization. Now, all of the cool stuff that we're doing now with APIs, I'm going to say it's relatively easy to share data between systems when you're talking about an API to API relationship. However, back in the legacy days, we had things like ODBC and RPC that connected systems together, and those are notorious for actually being able to be exploited. And so that legacy technology, in a lot of cases, may not be able to be isolated from your Active Directory because it's using Active Directory to authenticate various users in using old protocols that we know from, Cybersecurity History 101 are ancient. And so protecting these endpoints can be really difficult. And we're talking about like old versions of Oracle, Log4j type of vulnerabilities that may not be initially exposed to the internet, but could potentially be exploitable. And I mentioned exploitable protocols like NTLM version 1, which is still floating around there, or God forbid, service message block, which was instrumental in allowing the propagation of the malware family of NotPetya and WannaCry, originally based on double pulsar and eternal blue cyber weapons that got into the wrong hands. And the other big thing to think about is those forgotten systems, those systems that were spooled up for a specific project, or those systems that were spooled up for proof of concepts, or even, to facilitate remote development. Those forgotten systems are kind of some of the most dangerous things that you can have. And we know with tools like DNS Dumpster that we can find those systems and potentially exploit them, right. So I keep hitting that wrong button, but there we go. So let's talk a little bit about human mistakes and insider threat and how this whole environment can be really, really difficult. So the first part, I want to call out the Microsoft Teams and Outlook down after the networking configuration issues. A lot of were discovered to be the patient zero. Configuration changes of any sort in the infrastructure are harbingers of potential destruction and one of the earliest parts of the MITRE attack table. And so configurations, especially ones that can't be traced in large enterprise to a ServiceNow ticket or a CAB change control, tend to be potential indicators of a compromise of the infrastructure. Now, sometimes it is a mistake, but detecting that a mistake has occurred will allow the organization to respond correctly and back out. So yes, did we suffer some downtime and a horrific amount of frustrations with teams, other than the normal level of frustrations that you get with teams? We did. But it was quickly determined by the various capabilities that the security team and the network operations team that it was not a cyber attack. And actually, in a lot of ways, this is a level of assurance that businesses need to have today, that there is a human that made a mistake or a system that went offline by accident or on purpose. Unscheduled downtime is a reality, but we need to quickly move into the discovery of whether or not we actually have a threat actor and whether or not we can take appropriate measures. Now, I shared this Southern District of New York press release, and I think we've made available online the indictment on this particular individual, Nicholas Sharp. Now, what was really interesting thing about this particular indictment is he did all sorts of things. Now, the plot here was to pretend that the company had been data breached and established a bunch of footholds in order to extract a ransom for the data that this insider threat had stolen from the organization. And in order to continually leverage the potential ransom from the stealing of the data, he fell into, I would say, the typical threat actor who then goes to the media and basically says, I have all this company's data. And that had a catastrophic effect on the valuation of this particular company. Now, what is incredible and mind-boggling is in this indictment, all of the steps it took, from altering logs to installing VPN software on endpoints, which for any managed detection and response offering shows all of the different steps that could be taken by an insider or that could be taken in a threat actor that has gained access to the system. All of those would make the console go wild. And I think this is a really important aspect of managed detection and response. It's almost like an insurance check to make sure that there isn't any hinky behavior going on in the organization, right? Related to unauthorized changes related to software installation, et cetera, et cetera. So I really urge you to read this particular indictment. It's a public document. It's not copyright. It's as a result of the alleged crimes that this individual had done. Well, they're no longer alleged because he was essentially sentenced or will be sentenced. So I believe he's been found guilty. Generally, when an issue is in flight like this, the guilt has already, basically been applied beyond a reasonable doubt here. But I urge you to read this because it really does bring forward the ideas of all of the signs that something bad is going on within that organization. Now, I talked about the rapid exploitation, and we really need to understand a couple of things here. If your company has infrastructure that you've left on the outside of the organization and it's unprotected by any sort of controls other than user ID and password, you're just looking for trouble. And it's to the point now where the exploitations come rapidly. They are done by going to tools like Shodan in non-targeted attacks and just building a list. So one of the most intelligent and interesting cybersecurity researchers today is a fellow by the name of Daniel Card. I follow him on Twitter. We're really great friends. And Shodan has an ability that is going to scare the bejeegers out of everyone. It has the ability to template the login pages for web services as a hash value. Okay, so what does that mean? It literally means you can search Shodan, which is like an infrastructure search engine for the internet. Think of it as a Google, but more along the lines of finding all the infrastructure that's out there, okay? And how you can do this is if you take the hash value for ESXi's login page, you can search for that hash value on Shodan, and it shows you all of the matches for this. And interestingly enough, he said this is in the number, it's in the thousands of ESXi management consoles that have been exposed to the internet without a compensating control. So the problem now comes is that if this hypervisor can be exploited, and it was, you can end up with a massive amount of damage to your infrastructure very, very quickly. VMware also, but the VMware version that is targeted here is from the vintage of 2014. And again, by basically getting the hash value for the VMware console of the 2014 era, you can rapidly search the entire internet for targets. And that is actually being done by threat actors. Same for Microsoft Remote Desk Protocol on older machines, such as 2008 vintage and 2010 vintage server, or server 2012 vintage, that haven't been patched or updated. There are easy exploits to find for that have all been weaponized in things like Kali Linux and the Metasploit console that can easily own a remote desktop protocol server. Now, this is heartbreaking for many organizations because on that remote desktop server is several hundreds, if not potentially thousands, of user IDs and passwords contained within that server itself. So the threat actor that can gain access to the remote desktop server can gain access to literally potentially hundreds of user IDs that can either be brute forced or in some cases, if it's stored insecurely, can be easily enumerated, especially if that remote desktop server gives access to a legacy application that uses something like NTLM or SMB v1 to authenticate to other services. So you see what I'm saying, folks? If this Microsoft remote desktop server is messed with in any particular way, the tools such as Mimkatz that can extract the passwords from memory within the system, or any of the other old school hacker tools, if those are loaded up onto that remote desktop server, it's over. And that entire server is owned, and the threat actors can rapidly spread through an organization. This is why these have to be, these boxes that are exposed to the internet, the Microsoft Exchange on-premise, the remote desktop protocol boxes have to be protected in a number of different ways with a secure application gateway that requires 2FA. And I think Microsoft Exchange needs to be called out specifically in this because so many organizations are getting hacked by Outlook Web Access that hasn't been properly protected, that the security policies of the organization are inadequate, and in some cases, the web services themselves that are not proxied, and they're just stuck out there on the internet, and you're asking for trouble when that happens. And finally, the Fortinet VPN series of vulnerabilities has been rapidly exploited by threat actors to the point where there has been a number of patches and a number of organizations that have been exploited. Now, the Fortinet VPN was a particular concern because some organizations did not enable the SSO capabilities on this device, single sign-on, okay? What did that mean? Well, what it meant was in a lot of cases, organizations decided to manage the user access, including privileged access, by the way, for like the IT support people. They enabled the Fortinet's own user ID and password database. Well, that was a terrible idea because in some cases, these vulnerabilities were simply ask the Fortinet VPN device for all of the user IDs and passwords that it contained in its local database, all right? Well, in some cases, those local user IDs and passwords for the Fortinet, for convenience sake, were also the Active Directory passwords for the users. So what happened is this. The VPN was exploited, valid user IDs and passwords were obtained. That led to authenticated, in some terms, privileged access into the network. And then, of course, as soon as they had access to the network, they used those same privileged accounts to log in to servers and remote workstations and drop ransomware payloads all over the place. So this is why a managed detection and response and EDR and XDR and all of these different technologies have to be on those endpoints, on those servers to protect them from when you have a vulnerability that's being exploited in something as sensitive as your VPN concentrators and your firewall capabilities. And I just want to point out, this is another article where I got quoted in by Matthew Schwartz on this particular attack. Patching hypervisors is really difficult work because every server that's on there basically needs to have downtime in order to patch and update the hypervisor. And then all of the systems that are running have to be brought up. And you pray to the gods that your images are not corrupted, because otherwise you're now restoring from your backup. So this issue with ESXi was a tough one on a lot of organizations because of that very fact that you're going to inflict a tremendous amount of, scheduled downtime on the organization to deal with this particular challenge. Right. And now we talk about the skills, capability, and preparation, and I'm going to be able to go. I'm going to be able to talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A session. But security awareness training baseline has to be in effect. And this is just not the click-through PowerPoint world we live in. Because when we look at the threat actors and we look at the threat, you're in a situation now where the security awareness training has to be customized to incorporate the social media or social engineering awareness that comes along with your roles and responsibility. Is it any wonder when someone announces they're just into a new role, and the role may be an executive level role, the role might be support, that is a very vulnerable person because They're new to the organization. They don't really know how things work, and they're super eager to please. And this is what happens in payroll departments. This is what happens in procurement departments, where the skilled social engineering attack can land malware into that environment with, in some cases, horrific results. The other thing to just be aware of is this is also the way fraud is weaponized by threat actors, and we can all laugh, but many people have fallen for the I need emergency gift cards for customers scam that continues to inflict a lot of issues. The other problem, too, is the lack of an incident response plan that has clarity within an organization. Many organizations might have a run book or playbook, but just as I showed in my actual in my actual sort of initial description of Operation Barbarossa, your incident plan may not take into account that side channel attack. Because again, I love to point this out. There's no such thing as an unknown risk. There is a surprise, right? You can't really know it's a risk in your organization if it's unknown, right? It's sort of like calling something very unique. It's impossible to have something that's very unique by its very definition of being unique. So the point here is that the incident response plan has to have some flexibility to it, because if you're locked into a particular playbook, right, I feel like you're going down the road of being not agile enough to respond to a blended type of threat or a hybrid threat or a compromised insider. One of the stories I love to tell about a security program that really worked properly was when a Tesla employee was approached by a Russian operative who offered them a tremendous amount of money to stick a USB drive into Tesla's infrastructure. Now, that was a massive success because the employee had the presence of mind and loyalty to go to the security team at Tesla, who then engaged the FBI. They did a sting operation, and they arrested the Russian responsible for trying to corrupt that employee to get them to stick that USB drive in. That's a huge win. That's a great way of benchmarking that the security at Tesla, with regards to that particular employee, not only knew the right thing to do, but managed to make sure that the actual perpetrator of what could have been a massive data leak and perhaps ransomware outbreak within the Tesla Corporation was completely mitigated by the actions of one individual. That's just a huge success story. The other thing to do is I've seen incident response plans sit on the shelf. And this is a huge problem. You don't know if it works if you don't try it. And part of that whole incident response plan has to be the engagement with your vendors, has to be the engagement with your SOC if it's outsourced, or your MSSP or your MSP. Because the incident response plan, you need to bring in experts, and especially in the mid-market, cybersecurity professionals may not have the comprehensive skills to do everything from digital forensics to the actual activity, which would include the restoration of the systems and the restoration of the business services. So this is a big nut to crack, because really incident response as a tabletop exercise, and perhaps even as a simulation, becomes a really important part of the organization, because the last thing you want to do is be in the middle of a crisis and have to put together a network map, right? The last time you want to be in the middle of successfully eradicating the threat, but unfortunately some of your data was corrupted by the ransomware attack, and learning that the backups for this particular system didn't occur, or were corrupted or whatnot. So all of these things have to be taken into account, because when you go through the incident response plan, which is just generally triage, investigation, containment, eradication, and return to normal operations, it's critical that everyone knows what their role is, and that when you need extra help, that you get that help as quickly as possible. Audits and pen tests, I like to say, are the harbingers of destruction within your organization because they will show your vulnerabilities, your issues, and again, you need to take a risk-based approach on making sure that you're aware of that hinky behavior that could lead you to discover the fact that you've been compromised. Oh, what? For 3 years, GoDaddy? Come on, guys. That's a pretty embarrassing situation. I guess we blew the old 72-hour to report deadline by a fair margin on that one. So I really think that we are in a situation where we require an enhanced level of incident response. And then, of course, I love to say, yes, MDM 100% are the Eldritch Archers coming to the fight at Helm's Deep because to me, this is the next level of defenses an organization needs in order to fight off the threats of today, current state, and the threats that will evolve in the future. So with that, let's get a couple of questions in, and then we're going to turn it over to Red Canary.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. We do have a couple of questions. I'm going to try to squeeze as many of them in as we can in the next couple of minutes. We have a great one from Wahid, who asks, should MDR be part of SOC as a service, or should MDR be a separate service?
It's interesting to me because I kind of think that it needs to be holistically integrated into your SOC, and whether that's in-house or outsourced, because managed detection and response is going to be kind of one part of your strategy in these new layers of defense that I talked about, right? And part of the stuff that I didn't talk about is context of what is going on. And in order to provide that context, you have to have some sort of SIM capability there to look at all of the things, to look at that lateral movement across the network, to look at that entry point that might have come in from the cloud and then moved down into the on-premise network, or a compromised endpoint that is trying to reach into the sensitive parts of your organization and trying to defeat your security and actively manipulating things on those endpoints in order to try and laterally move. So MDR, I think, is a big part of your cybersecurity strategy, but I think it needs a bit of context around other stuff.
Great. From Leah, in the cases you outlined, ESXi and VMware, Exchange, RDP, and Fortinet, would MDM have made a difference?
Yeah, I think it really does shine on this. Because when you're looking at sort of that holistic view of your network, any sort of hinky behavior on desktops and servers and endpoints and even the network itself, if the managed detection and response offering can pull data that indicates that there's an emerging cyber event, and these are the MITRE attack table indicators that I've detected, I think it can give you that golden hour and give you more time to intervene. So I think from all of these cases where initial access has come into the organization, it's what happens next. That to me is the most important part of this aspect. And I think managed detection and response is sort of the answer to a lot of those questions and being able to shut down lateral movement and attempts at compromise, and even in some cases exfiltration of data if it's super blatant.
Great. And one last question from John. So you're saying Nicholas did things that MDM would have picked up on. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, 100%. When you look at the activities that took place in that particular organization, you just shake your head because, in the post-game analysis, it's so obvious that something crazy was going on in that organization. And I firmly believe that the managed detection and response and something called user behavior entity analysis, or UBEA, which is sort of your machine learning AI capabilities, that are in those endpoint products today really do make a difference and really can pick up on that strangeness that says, hey, there is very much likely to be, a security incident that is starting or is in progress, and immediate action needs to be taken.